All right. Hello, everyone. Before we get started, I would like to let you know that this program is being recorded and it will be available on the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum website and YouTube page after this presentation. Welcome to the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum's virtual lecture series talking about race matters. Join the conversation. My name is Melissa Keevey. I'm the executive director of the museum. We are thrilled to continue this series that commenced in August of 2020 and was so well received that we extended it to a biannual series. We appreciate the return of our loyal attendees and extend a warm welcome to those joining us for the first time. This series was initiated during a tumultuous period marked by the tragic deaths of unarmed Black individuals and the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. Our aim has always been to foster a dialogue and unity on a subject that can sometimes be challenging. This session of Talking About Race Matters is a 3-week series centered around fashion and creative self-expression. Our presenters will explore these topics beginning with the period of enslavement in the United States and ending with present-day influences in fashion. I want to point out a few things about Zoom to ensure your questions and comments are answered. If you have any technical assistance questions, our digital content and programs manager, Caroline, will be able to answer those for you. You can just pop them in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Additionally, if you have questions for the speaker, please also use the Q&A and we will answer those questions at the end of the presentation. The Dyckman Farmhouse Museum would like to thank everyone for participating in our second presentation, or our third presentation of this February's Talking About Race Matters lecture series. The overwhelming response to this lecture series makes it clear that there's a need for platforms that allow us to talk about the issues that divide us and indeed the issues that unite us as Americans. The Dyckman team believes our programming should be accessible to all, and so most of our programming is completely free. This means that we strive to make as many of our programs free as we can. And as a small nonprofit organization, we do rely on grants and donations to support this mission. Tonight, we are joined by Elizabeth Way, Associate Curator of Costume at the Museum at the Fashion Institute of Technology. Elizabeth will discuss how Black people have always significantly shaped American fashion through their style, their labor, and as innovative fashion makers. From 19th century dressmakers, both enslaved and free, to transitional creatives who help navigate what an American designer could be, and late 20th century designers embedded in the formal New York industry, Black people have always been a driving force in American fashion. Their stories, however, are often left out of the narrative. Examining the lives and careers of just a few starts to create a more holistic understanding of American fashion and its wider impacts on culture and society. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Elizabeth Way presenting Redressing American Fashion, Black Designers in the 19th and 20th Centuries. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you so much to the Dyckman Farmhouse for having me, to Melissa and Caroline for all their amazing organizational skills. And I also honored to end this series coming after Chain of Ignite and Monica Miller. So hopefully my talk will be as interesting as theirs, because I know they're both amazing scholars. So I'm going to share a bit of my screen. And we'll get started. And so before I get too far into this, I do want to do a little tiny bit of housekeeping in terms of terms. So this idea of enslaved makers, transitional makers, and then what we think of as modern fashion designers, these are terms that I've kind of come up with to help ground my research. And these are 3 specific periods that I think about, but these are periods that overlap and kind of transition one into the other. But as we think about the 19th century and the early 20th century, we definitely have this idea of of dressmakers, of mantua makers. And this is a period when clothing is going to be custom made. People would go to their dressmaker, they might bring their own fabric, and they would have a discussion about what they wanted made. As we get into the later 20th century, we see the rise of the fashion designer. And this is a concept that was really originated in Paris and doesn't really start to take a firm hold in American fashion until about the 1960s. And so we see kind of a transition to a quote unquote professionalization of the fashion industry as the kind of a creative industry in that way. So hopefully those are terms that will help us navigate the different makers that I want to talk about today. So the first object that I want to share with you is this beautiful, quite humble cotton dress from the collection of the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. So we don't know much about the makers. We know that they were enslaved women, or possibly one woman, living in the American South. Um, but what we know about these dressmakers, these tailors, shoemakers, weavers, dyers, they all brought knowledge with them when they came, when they were forced from West Africa and Central Africa to the United States. So many of them came from agricultural areas, and they had their own knowledges and skills about weaving, dyeing, sewing, all of these things. On top of that, West Africa was a very cosmopolitan area. Some of them spent more or less time there, but we have a lot of different cultures, including clothing cultures, coming together at that site. So these people were not kind of ignorant of fashion as a concept or of the skill or labor it took to create it. Now, of course, they were forced to adapt to European styles of making and dressing, and they were able to adapt to this with relative success, I mean, almost across the board. In the 19th century, most women, whether they were Black or white or otherwise, were expected to do some kind of sewing. The skills that we see in this dress are dressmaking. And so these are two different sets of skills, but I don't want to kind of denigrate the idea of just stitching or sewing or being a seamstress, because that took a lot of skill and dexterity. You had to know how to create different stitches and different tension for different parts of a dress, but dressmaking would have been a more advanced skill. So we know that enslaved people both participated in fashion culture and made clothing for themselves, their enslavers, and others. What we don't know about this dress was who it was made for. It is quite a humble dress. It could have been made for other enslaved women, or it could have been a house dress made for a white person. What we do see is an interaction with European fashion. So you can see all of the pleats in the center bodice here, and we can see ever so slightly them moving towards the center to create a very shallow V shape. And that V-shaped bodice is really fashionable in the 1840s. Now, the pleating distribution around the skirt also is something that was popular in the 1850s, 1860s, which is why there's such a wide date range in this dress. It's also very possible that it's been remade over the decades as well. But we clearly see how the makers were looking at European fashion, whether through fashion plates, whether through existing clothing, and taking those ideas and integrating them into this dress. And so 18th, 19th, and even early 20th century fashion makers were not typically recorded if they didn't label their clothing, which was not typical until the 20th century. And this is especially true for enslaved and free Black makers. And so we see a real dearth of the records, of them within the records, but that doesn't mean that their material culture doesn't exist. And of course, this can be proven by an exception. So this is actually a really remarkable piece of material culture. So this is a dress hem that is signed. It was signed by its wearer, and it says dress made in 1864 by Combo, wife of Jim Dry, the carriage driver, mother's seamstress, about the age of Sister Sarah Ann. So this was actually signed by the wearer's daughter. But this is an entire biography written in the hem of a dress. So the woman who made this, her name was actually Cumber, not Combo. She constructed this cotton dress for her mistress, Janie Wright Robertson McKethrin, in 1864 during the height of the Civil War. So we have this brief biography of her written inside of this dress. And we know that she worked at the Robeson plantation near Tar Heel, North Carolina. She was married to Jim Dry, the plantation's carriage driver, with whom she had 7 children. Because of the import of cloth and clothing radically decreased during the Civil War, the textile to make this dress would have been very, very expensive. It would have been kind of snuck into the country through blockade runners, and it might have cost as much as $8 a yard, which we think about in 1864 was an enormous sum. Nonetheless, Robertson and McCathron insisted on maintaining an up-to-date wardrobe during the war, requiring great efforts by Cumber. Yet it's this sewing work that also allows her to eke out a living for herself and endure the remaining days of slavery in the United States. So we have a lot of stories wrapped up in just this one dress. Now, there are countless dresses in museum collections made by Black fashion makers. And some of these pieces were worn by prominent women and therefore influenced the course of American fashion. We do know who made the dress on the left because this was a dressmaker who was able to record her own history. And that woman is Elizabeth Keckley. So she had a fascinating life story, which I'm going to go to in a second. But these were two of her top clients when she worked in Washington, D.C. during the 1860s. So, of course, we recognize Mary Todd Lincoln on the left. Before she worked for Lincoln, she worked for Verena Davis, wife of Jefferson Davis. She was invited to the Jefferson home to sew for them. She had a personal relationship with Verena Davis, such that Mrs. Davis offered to bring her south after the outbreak of the war and protect her. She refused and stayed in Washington, D.C. But her skill was such that it really cut across these political lines, these racial lines. She was the best dressmaker in Washington, D.C., and everyone wanted dresses made by her. So this is an image of Elizabeth Keckley. She left several images behind, as well as several pieces of material culture. The Lincoln dress that we saw on the previous slide also exists as a extant dress, although it's been heavily altered. So she was born in 1818 in Dinwiddie County, Virginia. She was born enslaved, and she later found out that her owner, Colonel Armistead Burrell, was her father. But she spent her young years were really formed by her mother. And her mother taught her sewing and dressmaking, also taught her to read and write. And these are skills that make her visible to us in the historical record today. So the book she wrote was called Behind the Scenes, or 30 Years a Slave and 4 Years in the White House. And it was published in 1868. And this is a fascinating read. It's available online for free if you're interested. And it's actually a very respected piece of historical documentation on Lincoln and Lincoln's family. She spent a lot of time with them, especially Mary Todd Lincoln at the White House. So she grew up until her teenage years in Virginia, and then she moved around with what she later realized with her half sisters and half brothers around the country as they kind of dispersed. So she spent a little bit of time in Hillsborough, North Carolina, and we see from her records, from her memoir, that she was constantly in contact with her mother, and they were talking about fashion. She asked her mother to send her new dresses. She does a lot of sewing for the local community and her owners. And eventually she moves with another of the Burrell children to St. Louis, Missouri. And this is a real change for her because St. Louis was a really growing boom town at this time. It was upriver from New Orleans. And we see a lot of people kind of moving from New Orleans to St. Louis. And this connection to New Orleans is really important because at this time, fashion inspiration is really coming from Paris. That's no one would deny, American, British, anyone, no one would deny that Paris is where women's fashion came from. And so because of the Francophile city of New Orleans, we have a lot of people reading French fashion magazines and really tapped into the newest styles. A lot of these people are coming up and back from St. Louis, and Elizabeth Keckley is just exposed to a more sophisticated clientele, and she's really able to kind of up-level her skills. At one point, she was supporting a household of over 17 people, white people, with her needle. And even though she was still enslaved at this time, she really experienced what life would be like as a free woman. As the breadwinner, she kind of came and went as she pleased. But she talks about in her memoir how important it was for her to gain her freedom in a way that was acceptable. That was, she could have crossed the river into freedom almost at any point. And in fact, she did cross the river and come back for her business. And so she talked to her owners for years and years, asking them to set a price for her freedom for both her and her son. They eventually settled on $1,200, which is an enormous sum in the 1840s. And she tried several different methods, including reaching out to abolitionist organizations in New York to raise the money. But in the end, she borrowed it from her clients, her dressmaking clients in St. Louis. They lent her the money, and she, as a free woman, worked for 5 years in St. Louis and repaid them the money, and then she moved to Washington, D.C. So this is really a remarkable story. We have so few accounts of enslaved men and women that exist today, and it just goes to show how many incredible stories are out there that we have no idea existed. But Elizabeth Keckley's does seem to be kind of extraordinary in that way, and it was really fueled by her enormous design skills. So this is a piece that's in the Smithsonian American History Collection in the First Ladies Hall. And this was made for Mary Todd Lincoln in 1864. It comes with two bodices. This was a very practical feature of 19th century dresses because of dress etiquette. So you'll see on the top, the long sleeves are for daytime. And then we have a short sleeved bodice that's much lower cut for evening. And then, of course, you can reuse that skirt that takes up so much fabric. We know that when she moved to Washington, D.C., she slowly had to rebuild her client network. There was some kind of connections between Washington, D.C. and St. Louis, so she was able to get by on some recommendations, but she really had to rebuild her network from the ground up. And her dresses were her calling card. When she would have one woman come to her, she would create a dress. That woman would show up at a party. Other people would ask her where she got the dress, and that's how she built her clientele. She met Mary Todd Lincoln because she was invited to interview with the First Lady when the First Lady first moved to the city. She missed her first interview, but she attended her second, and Lincoln had already heard good things about her from friends in St. Louis and hired her to be her dressmaker. So we have several extant gowns that she made for Lincoln. But this is, I think, a really special piece because this is made for a woman named Nancy Ordway. And she's someone we might consider a little bit more of a regular person, though certainly very well off. She was the wife of a postal official in Lincoln's administration. And we know that the information that Keckley made this dress was passed down in the Ordway family before the dress was eventually given to the Smithsonian. Now, what I love about this dress, and you'll notice that on the skirt we have this very bright green ribbon against this kind of muddier olive green. These would have been the same color, but we see how dyes change, especially these synthetic analyzed dyes change over time. But being able to look at the inside of this dress, the purple velvet dress has been on display for a long time. I've never been able to look at the inside. But this was a piece I was able to really kind of dig into, so to speak. And her dressmaking skills are absolutely incredible. The tiny details, the way these kind of metal hooks and eyes are punched into the bodice so it's as seamless as possible. It's really an extraordinary piece, even though it's not as fancy as the velvet dress she made for Lincoln. But I also want to talk a little bit about the way she used fashion to communicate her own standing in society and her dignity. I can only assume that she created these dresses that she are wearing in these photographs. And people who knew her talked about how correct she was, how upstanding, how dignified she was. She always carried herself with dignity. And her fashion certainly comes across to kind of reinforce this persona. And she was a woman who was really tapped into her community. Having a connection to the White House in Washington, D.C., which had the largest free Black population before the Civil War of any city in the United States, having connection to the White House meant you were kind of a socialite within the Black community. And so she was certainly that. Um, but this is a incredible kind of photograph of um, the building where she rented her shops. So you can see this little brick building still stands, and then you can see it kind of dwarfed by larger buildings in the next photo. But she rented rooms and she trained other Black women in a time when Black women were enslaved or worked in very low paying, could be dangerous work. She provided highly skilled, safe employment for other Black women in her shops. She retired eventually and went on to teach at Wilberforce University in Ohio, and that's where this picture on the right was taken. And she became the head of the home economics department. The museum at Wilberforce actually holds a diploma that she signed. She signed her students' diplomas when they graduated. So she was committed to kind of passing this knowledge on to other Black women, training them in her profession. She talks about in her book how strict she would be with the women in her workshops, that they wouldn't bend over their work, that they held it up in front of their faces so they wouldn't ruin their backs, because she'd been doing this her whole life. She kind of knew the tricks to kind of have a long career. So she was really a remarkable person. And besides all of her fashion work, she was also an abolitionist. She knew Frederick Douglass and Henry Highland Garnet, really a remarkable woman. And we know her story because she wrote it down. Because of that, we are able to find her birth record in the plantation book where she was born. We were able to find her manumission records at the St. Louis, at the Missouri Historical Society. Because of the clues that she left us, we're able to fit her into the historical record. So the next dressmaker I want to talk about is kind of moving into this more transitional phase. And in terms of transition, I kind of mean the transition from enslavement to freedom. But this again is a very kind of nebulous distinction. So this is a bodice made by a woman named Lavinia Price, and she was enslaved in Alabama, and she was born in 1857. But she worked as a dressmaker after gaining her freedom. We can only assume that she worked as a dressmaker during her enslavement as well. And this is a silk moire ensemble that also has a skirt with it, believed to have been made by Price for her employer, and then the employer later returned it to her. But after emancipation, she moved to Boston and she set up her dressmaking business there. And so we see how pieces like this are a bridge, a gateway to help women take the skills that they learned in enslavement, whether they practiced them themselves or they learned them from their mothers or grandmothers, and transform that enslaved labor into free labor. And this was a piece that was inherited by her granddaughter, who is also a designer. Her name is Lucy Cordyce. And so we see those skills being passed down even after the enslavement period ends. And so that's what I kind of talk about when I think about this transition. But it's also really important to point out that not all dressmakers, milliners, etc., were enslaved before the Civil War. This is an advertisement from Freedom's Journal, which is the first Black newspaper published in the United States. It's from New York. And this was an ad placed shortly after New York abolished slavery in the state. And so this woman, Sarah Johnson, she makes hats and she makes dresses. And we can't understate how important these members of the Black community were, tailors, dressmakers, milliners, to help this population refashion themselves as a free community. In the 19th century, there was a real idea that, that how you dressed said something very real about you. Today we think more about like don't judge a good book by its cover, things like that. That wasn't really the case in the 19th century. So it was really important that this Black community could dress respectably, dress well, to earn respect for themselves in this very kind of tumultuous situation that they found themselves, even as free people. A little bit later, we can think about Mahibitl Primus. So this is a dress that we believe she made for her daughter. Mahibitl Primus was a prolific dressmaker in Hartford, Connecticut. This is a piece that is held by the Wadsworth Athenaeum, and we know that it was made for Rebecca Primus. And Rebecca Primus really, the thing that really distinguished her in a lifetime of education and service is that she, as a Northerner and a free Black woman, went down to Port Royal, not Port Royal. Uh, I forget the exact name of the town, but she went down to Maryland on the Eastern Shore and she set up a school in this town. And it was the first school for Black, both adults and children. And she spent several years there. Royal Oak is the name of the town. And she spent several years there setting up a school, having the building made, and just spreading education. What's really interesting is that her letters still exist, and we see a real disconnect in this idea of respectability politics. This woman was a Yankee, she was a Northerner, she was very well educated. Both of her parents had been free for generations in Connecticut. Both of them were very high standing members of the community. There were much fewer Black citizens in Hartford in the 1860s, 1870s. And so to a certain point, the white community kind of left them alone. And so the Primuses were able to buy a house on a main street, and they were a very kind of well-known family among both white and Black Hartford. And she was shocked when she came down south. She talked specifically about clothing, about how the adults and the children will take off their shoes when the weather gets warm, how the clothes they wear are too bright and too garish. So we see this real respectability politics kind of at play, which is very, very interesting. But it also is really important to emphasize that Black communities are not a monolith in this country or any. We have so many differences, so much diversity within Black communities down to the individual that you can't really say one thing about Black fashion at this time or any other. But this is a beautiful dress, really well preserved and really beautifully made. We assume there's so many letters between Rebecca and her mother talking about clothing, having her mother make her clothing, send her clothing, that we are strong evidence that Mehibital Primus made this for her daughter. This is a dress made by Fanny Criss, and she was a dressmaker based in Richmond, Virginia. And what's really interesting about this, her and this period in Richmond's history, is that we start to see how Jim Crow is encroaching on the freedoms and liberties of middle-class Black business owners. Fanny Criss was a very well-respected dressmaker. It was a lucrative business for her. She owned a lot of property, 3 or 4 buildings in Richmond. And at the same time that these very elite women patronize her, white women of the city are patronizing her, they are also very active in promulgating this lost cause mythology. We see this mythology kind of spring up around the turn of the century, trying to recast the Civil War and the enslavement period as benign or even beneficial to Black people. And these people, these women who are invested in the lost cause mythology, were really interested in history and kind of preserve and own and tell those historical narratives from their point of view. And it's not only, but a big reason why Fanny Criss's dresses still exist is because these are the type of women who would love to give their dresses to museums. But this kind of lost cause mythology was very harmful to Black people at the turn of the century and for as long as it was happening in the Jim Crow South. They were trying to segregate the streetcars at this time, not to keep domestic workers or Black laborers, working class laborers out of the city, but to keep middle class Black people, people like Fanny Criss or others who worked as dentists or lawyers or doctors. They wanted to keep these people out of the center of Richmond because this was an element that they felt they couldn't control. So we have a lot of things wrapped up into this time period of Richmond's history. And eventually, Fanny Criss does participate in the Great Migration and move to New York City. But we can also just appreciate the absolute astounding quality of her work. We have this beautiful Art Nouveau lace detail in her dress, and the Valentine Museum actually owns 4 of her dresses. So this is another really great example of a transitional designer. Fanny Criss's parents were born enslaved. She was born free, but she uses, she stands on, the successes of her parents to build her own business, to build a life for herself that eventually takes her to New York. Now, the next designer I want to talk about is someone very kind of close to my research heart. This is Anne Lowe. I've done a lot of work on Anne Lowe, and she's a really remarkable kind of person, just like Keckley, and really all of these designers had just a completely fascinating life. And her story really encompasses almost all of the narratives that we've discussed so far. She learns her skills from her grandmother and her mother, who are both enslaved. And she starts training at the age of 5 or 6. So we think about learning skills at home and being like a home sewer. That's not the case of Anne Lowe. She was trained at home, but she was trained on a professional level. And she really loved fashion design. She talks about this throughout the interviews we have of her. She unfortunately didn't get much press on her career and her designs until much later in her career, but she really aligned herself and her fashion practice with an artistic creative output, much more in line with what we think about Parisian haute couture and with the way Christian Dior and Balenciaga talked about their work as art. But her grandmother and mother set up a dressmaking atelier in Montgomery, Alabama, from the end of the 19th century into the early 20th century. And they served the state's elites. During the 1910s, the governor's wife, for example, was a client. Lowe got married very, very young. And so even though she was a proficient dressmaker, her husband did not want her to work, wanted her to keep home. And she soon after had a baby, and so she gave up the business. But she was kind of pulled back in by tragedy. Her mother died unexpectedly right before New Year's when Lowe was only 16 years old. And so she stepped in to finish a big order of gowns for her mother's clients for the governor's New Year's Eve ball. And she talks about that moment and being able to finish these gowns up to kind of the satisfaction of her mother's clients. They said to her, "This is as good a work as your mother does." She said, "I really felt like I could do anything after that." And I think any of us who out here who are makers and can make something, whether it's cooking or sewing or anything, we kind of feel that the empowerment that comes with kind of working with your hands or creating something in that way. But she steps back from dressmaking, according to her husband's wishes, until another kind of insane occurrence happens. She was in a department store in Alabama in 1916, and she is spotted by a woman named Josephine Lee. So Josephine Lee is from Alabama, but she lives in outside of Tampa, Florida. She is the wife of a wealthy citrus businessman. And she sees Lowe in a department store and approaches her and asks her where she got her ensemble. She, basically says, "There's nothing like this around here. Where did you get this?" And Lowe tells her that she made it herself. And so Lee offers her a job on the spot to come live with her in Tampa, Florida, and sew for Josephine Lee and her 4 daughters. And Lowe says, she said, "I knew my husband wouldn't like it, but I took my baby and I got on that Tampa train." And the time with the Lees that she spent was really such an interesting period in fashion. Um, Her first task was to make matching wedding dresses and trousseaux for the 2 oldest Lee girls who were twins. They were matching everything. So they had matching wedding dresses. They were marrying brothers in a double ceremony. Um, and because of these images, we can see that Lowe could tailor. We have these beautiful mink-lined suits. She made these shirtwaist, Swiss waist costumes for the Lees. So these are pieces that no longer exist as garments, but through the Lee, Lowe stayed friends with the Lees her entire life, and she's almost like kind of a legend in their family. And at this point, I really just want to point out a woman named Margaret Powell, who is such an incredible researcher. She's really the first fashion scholar to take a serious look at Lowe. And she interviewed the Lees. She got down all of this amazing primary research. Unfortunately, she passed away in 2019. But Margaret was really the person who got the ball rolling on rediscovering Anne Lowe and fashion scholarship. But so Lowe lived with the Lees, sewing for them as their live-in dressmaker. And she, was kind of thriving in this environment. Of course, her client circle slowly expands to Lee's friends. And in 1917, she takes a small break out, 6 months, and she goes to fashion school in New York City. And this is with the complete support of the Lees. They help her pay for it. And she gets there, and the schoolmaster is surprised that she's Black. And he actually makes her sit segregated away from the other students in the class. But her work is so advanced. I mean, Lowe has been sewing since she was 5 years old. Her work is so advanced that he would come in, he would bring in her work to show the other students. The other students would stand at the door and watch her. And she actually graduated in half the time. So she's in 6 months in a year-long course. When she returns to Tampa, she continues her business and she remarries around 1920. So at this point, she moves out of the Lee home. She moves in with her husband into a Black neighborhood because, of course, this is the Jim Crow South. But we can see how Lowe, as a person who really supports and enriches the social life of wealthy white people, we see the ways in which she is both revered and also a victim of this Jim Crow discrimination. For example, this is a newspaper article published about Lowe in a local Tampa paper in 1926. And so they're interviewing Lowe as an expert on wedding dresses. She's made hundreds of wedding dresses up to this point. They want to know what's new, what do young brides want, what are traditions that are less popular. They picture her atelier. So this is an image in the center here of what we think is her workshop. And like Keckley, she is employing other Black women. She did not find kind of the skill level that she needed to support her shop in Tampa. So she had to train all of her own staff. Um, but when you read the article, it's very interesting because she talks about attending these weddings. She would make the bride's dress, the bridesmaids' dresses, often a lot of the attendees. So she would go to the wedding, to make sure no hems got stepped on, things like that. And she would wear a maid's uniform. She talked about wearing a white apron, black dress, and a little cap. And that was how she attended these society weddings, even though she's like, the artistic genius behind the design of these dresses. What's even more kind of galling about this article is that this is not actually an image of Lowe. Um, I've been very, very lucky to be able to converse with Anne Lowe's great granddaughter, and she picked it up right away. She's like, "This is not an image of Lowe." And so we see how Black people have been kind of misidentified through pictures throughout history. The first thing that comes to mind is the 18th century abolitionist, Oludala Equiano. We have a beautiful portrait of a man that might be Equiano, but it might be another abolitionist named Adoba Cuguano. And so the fact that these names have been disassociated from these images really kind of takes away from the importance of their power of representation. And so this is happening well into the 20th century and still happens today. But Lowe decides to make a permanent move to New York City in 1928. And she really at this point works in all different areas of the fashion industry. So she sets up her shop in 1928. Of course, the Great Depression starts in 1929, and she works for other manufacturers. She works on commission. She really takes any work that she can. This is a beautiful example of her work from the 40s. It's a custom wedding dress for a woman named Jane Trimington. And you'll see that there's these beautiful dimensional lilies at the neckline. So these are Bermuda lilies. Jane Trimington's family owned a series of stores in Bermuda, and so they had a special connection to the island. So you see all of these little details. This is why people went to Lowe and other couturiers to get a custom dress. This would not have been ready to wear off the rack. This would have been made especially for you. And Lowe is so great at adding these little personal details. And as we see some more images of her work, flowers were really her specialty. The other thing I want to point out about this dress is this is acetate and not silk. So by 41, we also already see the disruptions to the silk trade as Japan invades China in 31. So we know that Lowe worked for other manufacturers. She worked for a company called Sonia Gowns and made the dress that Olivia de Havilland wore when she won her Oscar in 1947. Lowe was not able to claim credit for this dress until much later in her career when she was able to claim it in the press. At this time, the New York fashion industry was really dominated by manufacturers. The idea of a designer, a standalone artistic designer, is not something that's very prevalent in New York. So it was very common for a manufacturer like Sonia Gowns or Hattie Carnegie or others to employ many designers. And of course, those garments would have the manufacturer label in it. Lowe was also very tapped into her community in Harlem. So this is a article that documents her trip to Paris in 1949. So the New York Age, a Black newspaper, sends Lowe to Paris to cover the couture shows. And here we have a design that Lowe made specifically for the readers of the Age based on the couture collection she saw that year. Now, I want to point out quickly Lowe's most famous dress. This is probably a recognizable woman to most of you. This is Jacqueline Kennedy. And again, Lowe was not really credited in the press for her amazing work until much later. And this was a job that was really heartbreaking for her because this was a dress that was on the front pages of newspapers, not just in this country, across the country, but also internationally. And she received no credit for it at the time. Although she served a very elite and very closed social group. So certainly the people that her clients knew that she made Kennedy's dress. But this was not something that was kind of spread in the press by these very elite women who they didn't really particularly want people to know kind of who their dressmakers were, et cetera. So I do want to talk about a few other makers before as we get into the 20th century. And what's really interesting and fascinating about Black fashion makers is that I've been studying maybe about 10 years, and I'm really just scratching the surface. There's so many amazing stories and material culture that really beg for more research. A really incredible designer is Zelda Wynne Valdez. Now, she was also a couturier making custom-made dresses, but her specialty was really performance wear. And you can see this beautiful bodice that she made for Dorothy Dandridge. And this was really her specialty, that like skin-tight fitted bodice on these beautiful performance dresses. She also worked, her other clients included people like Eartha Kitt or Josephine Baker or even Mae West. And at this time, we start to see Black designers breaking into what we think of as the formal fashion industry. We think about 7th Avenue, we think about ready-to-wear or off-the-rack clothing, and how that has really been the identity of New York fashion since that time. New York was better at ready-to-wear than any other place. Paris didn't really get their ready-to-wear industry down until the 1960s, but New York was had mastered ready-to-wear by the 1920s. And so this garment trade, what used to be called the rag trade, kind of went through this almost rebranding in the 1960s and 70s into the fashion industry. And we start to see name designers kind of fight for their place on labels of clothing. So some white designers who were really pioneering in this were people like Norman Norell or Claire McCardell. So of course, people like Zelda Wynn and Anne Lowe, because they made custom one-off pieces, we do see their labels in their clothing. But if we think about off-the-rack clothing, there's a real fight for designers to get their name on there instead of the manufacturer. So John Weston is a really great example of someone who is kind of more what we think of as a designer in this contemporary sense. For example, he attended fashion school. He is an alum of FIT. He worked in different aspects of the area, or excuse me, different aspects of the industry. For example, he worked for manufacturers designing belts and shoes and ladies' dresses, really trying to get a job anywhere he could. And then he eventually kind of goes out on his own and starts his own fashion company. So this is a story that we can kind of think about when we think about almost any contemporary designer, young designer working today. But during the late 60s and 1970s, there seems to be, the fashion press seems to kind of clock this trend of Black designers. And the 70s is kind of this era of very prominent Black designers. And of course, they were prominent Black designers before this period and after this period, but this is a period, the 70s, when they're particularly visible in the mainstream press. And three of the most important are Scott Barry, Stephen Burrows, and Willie Smith. And so one of the things you'll notice as we moved from Anne Lowe and Zelda Wynn to John Weston and these three designers is that we're really starting to codify the idea of a designer, either Black or white, as male. And so this is a change that happens as the idea of the creative designer rises. That is a figure that is kind of coded male. And so we see these really beautiful, what are referred to as dressmakers, kind of be shunted aside in favor of these male designers. Which isn't to say that they didn't do really extraordinary work. And designers like these, and particularly Stephen Burrows, really helped put New York on the map as a fashion capital. Before the 1970s, no one would have compared Paris to New York in any way in terms of fashion. It was really during that decade that New York kind of stepped onto the world stage as a fashion city. And the last designer I want to talk about is Patrick Kelly. So he's an American designer. He grew up in Mississippi, and he moved to Paris for his career. He tried to make it work in New York City, and he couldn't find the opportunities he was looking for. And so he moved to Paris, and that's really where he spent the majority of his career. He died really early of AIDS in 1990, but he established a really successful business selling ready-to-wear and also couture. And he was a really political designer. He embraced activism and challenging racial imagery, trying to code and rebrand these things to kind of take away their negative power. You can see this gollywog image. That was kind of a logo for his brand. But he was also an intensely creative and joyful designer. And so we kind of tend to think of the 70s as this era of Black designers, but there's so many moving forward. So I just want to end before we start questions with this one last piece. So this is a dress that was sewn by Rosa Parks. Most people don't know that Rosa Parks was a dressmaker. And she certainly has many, many things to be famous for, her brave work in civil rights, but she was a maker and a fashion designer. She was actually sewing this in the middle of creating this when she, started the bus boycott. So I want to end by pointing out the connections between fashion making and representation and activism. These early fashion makers, and even our more contemporary ones, they were activists. They were activists through the representation of simply being there to be seen, but also through the work that they made. So I'm going to stop sharing and see if there are any questions.
Yes, thank you so much. That was fascinating. And I think I have a few questions. We have some in the Q&A. I was wondering in the beginning of your talk how because you were talking about how dressmaking, like sewing and dressmaking are two different skill sets, and how the invention of the sewing machine, like, played into what they were able to accomplish, and what was access like to that kind of technology.
So the sewing machine comes into kind of more popular use, believe around the 1840s, but early sewing
Yeah.
machines were not very delicate. So you could do long seams like on a skirt with a sewing machine, but you couldn't sew a bodice or anything like that. So there's definitely a lot of hand sewing that continues to be used at this time. We know Elizabeth Keckley had a sewing machine. The Chicago History Museum has her sewing machine. So it was probably something that it's probably something her assistants used more than she did, because she would be the one draping, she would be the one fitting, and those kind of long seams that on skirts and things like that probably would have been gone to the seamstresses in her shop. But I do imagine it made kind of those kind of long, tedious tasks a little bit easier.
Okay. That's good to know. I think we have somebody else who would like to ask their question, and Caroline's going to let them do that. Alexandra, can you unmute and ask your question? Hmm. Okay, maybe not. Okay, we'll wait, and maybe we'll go on to another question, and we'll come back. Um, we have another question. Was it customary for the dress wearers to sign their garments? I think relating back to the beginning of the presentation, and were the dressmakers allowed to sign them?
So the idea of labeling dress of garments with labels is something I believe that comes in at the end of the 19th century. It was very kind of a practice that was kind of used indiscriminately. Famously, Charles Frederick Worth like consistently labeled his dresses as a couturier in Paris, and so that was something that was copied because he was such a prestigious name. But like certainly in the 1860s in Keckley's time, like a dressmaker wouldn't have had a label to sew in to a dress. And then but Anne Lowe, most of Lowe's pieces are labeled. She has like little labels printed up. So I think it's something that comes in around the turn of the century. But because a custom dressmaker, they could choose to or not. We do have some dresses that are labeled with the wearer's name. Especially something that Lowe did a lot was make what I call fantasy gowns. So she did a lot of debutante balls, and then sometimes these debutante balls would have like these fantasy themes. And so, for example, she did one in Omaha, Nebraska, where she made 33 of the same dress. So those dresses that are in museums now usually have the wearer's name in them. But because these are one-offs for individuals, they wouldn't necessarily write their name in them.
Why do you think it is that the wearers put their name in it? Was it like, so whoever's laundering it? No, I mean, like, I think when I put my name in my clothes, it's so that somebody knows, why, or that it's mine, so that it will return to me. But why would someone do that?
I think for like in that instance, there was like, dozens of the same dress, and perhaps like
Mm.
they were all getting dressed in the same place or something. It was for this very specific event. I think for that reason. In other cases, I think it might have been labeled by descendants, just to try and keep that knowledge.
Oh, that makes sense. Yeah. Are there any other fashion designers from the 80s and 90s that you could label as political designer as well, like Patrick Kelly?
Oh, yes. I mean, like Dapper Dan is a really amazing example, a hip hop designer. He
Mhm.
was like building this bridge between American sportswear and European luxury, labeling, and he was doing it, illegally. So like he was violating the copyright of these European design houses and creating this new type of fashion that's had such an amazing impact on how we all dress today. So I definitely feel like there's a political aspect to his work. Um, I'm trying to think of other designers. I think a lot of designers are, so many designers who worked on Seventh Avenue, especially in the 80s and 90s, where this kind of excitement around Black designers had gone away in the press. A lot of them in interviews you can read in the press at the time very distinctly don't want to be kind of known as Black designers. They want to be designers. They don't want to be asked about their designs in Black History Month. They want, the press to just come and cover their designs like anyone else, ask them about their inspirations, where they sell, etc. So I think that there was a real kind of closing off of the dialogue of this idea of embracing Blackness and this political idea that was really prevalent in the 60s and 70s that kind of went away in the 80s and 90s. So I'm sure there are others who were really political. But Patrick Kelly and Dapper Dan are the ones that really come to mind for me.
Okay. And then one of my staff really, really wants to know the answer to this question. Do you know which museums, if any, hold pieces by Anne Lowe, Zelda Wynne Valdez, and other designers you mentioned? Do you know if any of these pieces are currently on view? We're big museum nerds around here, so.
The Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture holds pieces by Lowe and Wynne Valdez and many other Black designers, and they have beautiful photography on their website. You can see these really detailed photographs. The Met holds a lot of different Anne Lowes, and one is on display right now in the Women Dressing Women exhibition. So I curated an exhibition on Anne Lowe at the Winterthur Museum in Delaware, which just closed this past January. And we borrowed pieces from the Museum of the City of New York, from my institution, the Museum at FIT, from the Henry Plant Museum, which is on the campus of University of Florida in Tampa. And they have 1920s Anne Lowes, which are incredible. Because those were just on display, they'll rest a little while. Cincinnati Art Museum has some beautiful Lowe's from the 1930s. Zelda Wynne Valdez's pieces are less prevalent than Lowe's because of just the kind of clothes that she was making. She was making performance wear that, got used a lot, whereas Lowe was making like wedding gowns and debutante gowns that tended to get saved. But I know the Smithsonian has some of her work. I'm not sure what other museums hold her work.
Okay. Sounds like we have some staff field trips in our future to go and visit these. That sounds really great. The next question is, what publications, including yours, would be good to read on this subject?
Well, I edited a book called Black Designers in American Fashion, in which I was very, very lucky to work with so many different scholars who really wrote about their expertise. So that is, and some of the images that you saw in my presentation are from those scholars. So I edited this volume, but I was really just able to harness all of their amazing work. The Anne Lowe exhibition did come with a publication, which is called Anne Lowe American Couturier. If you want to read more about Keckley, there's an amazing dual biography by a woman named Jennifer Fleischner of Mary Todd Lincoln and Elizabeth Keckley. They had a very close personal relationship that I didn't really get into. And then also her own memoir, which is available for free online. I believe it's through Doc South, but if you Google Elizabeth Keckley memoir, it'll come up. So those are some really great primary resources.
Okay. And along that same line, someone asked what resources you would recommend to learn more about fashion among enslaved people in the northern states specifically.
I don't have specific kind of references that come to mind, but I will recommend the Fashion and Race database, which is run by Kimberly Jenkins, which is an amazing resource. So if you have a university library, a local library that subscribes to it, you might be able to access it through there. And then a friend and amazing scholar named Jonathan Michael Square has a digital humanities project called Fashioning the Self in Freedom and Slavery. And both of those are really great to pointing you towards those resources. So in terms of kind of very specific research by state, I often have to turn to, specific books written about the state and kind of try to sift through for the fashion information. But those are two resources where you can really see a lot of that. I'll point you to the resources altogether.
Okay, great. That's a lot of resources. That's really great. Thank you. I think we have one last question. Who is your favorite Black designer from the 19th and 20th centuries and why?
I have to say Keckley and Lowe. I wrote my master's thesis on both Keckley and Lowe. I was at NYU and I was interning at the Smithsonian, and this was way before their building was built. This was in 2012. And so I was doing research on the Black Fashion Museum collection. And the Black Fashion Museum was created by a woman named Lois K. Alexander in Harlem. It's an amazing collection that the Smithsonian ended up acquiring. And those were the two designers that really stuck out to me. when I did this initial research, I'd never heard of them before. I was a year into graduate school. I'd taken fashion history as an undergrad. I'd never heard of them. But I think they both have such extraordinary lives. The way they, kind of rebuilt their client networks and their businesses in different cities several times throughout their lives. And just this idea of perseverance, making it through. I think that their life stories are absolutely fascinating, and the material culture is also just beautiful.
Great. We got more coming in. This is great. Are you curating any upcoming exhibits? I would hope that a large comprehensive exhibit will happen someday.
I definitely hope a large comprehensive exhibition on Black fashion makers, especially in the 19th and early 20th century, would happen one day. That's a lot of material culture and conservation work to bring it together. I'm curating an exhibition this fall at the museum at FIT called Africa's Fashion Diaspora. And it's really focused more on 20th and 21st century designers, but it's really thinking about how fashion contributes to the idea of a transnational Black culture. So we have people like Paul Gilroy in the Black Atlantic, or W.E. Du Bois, or Marcus Garvey, thinking about Pan-Africanism, the connections between Black people across cultures. And so I want to investigate how fashion designers have mined that idea. It's very prevalent in music and literature and philosophy, but I think fashion has a lot to say about kind of transnational Black culture.
Okay, we have another one. Thank you for your great work. I teach Black fashion in a gender studies department. What do you think the work of these women designers tells us about Black women's relationship to femininity?
Well, I'm actually working on my PhD right now. And one of the topics I think about is respectability politics and Black people and dress, Black women and dress. And, there was so many kind of pernicious ideas about Black women being unfeminine or being unchaste and all of these things in the 19th century. But especially in that time period, I mean, through the 1920s and later, I think there was a real investment in femininity among certain kind of class, especially classes of Black people. And this idea of dressing in modest and feminine ways as a way to kind of project this idea of respect. Sexual assault against Black women was so prevalent. And one of the ideas of respectability politics is by being respectable, protect yourself from that, which of course is not true, but it was a very closely held idea that was really heavily invested in. So I do think it's really interesting. And I think fashion designers, fashion makers among Black communities were really active participants in kind of helping Black people shape what they looked like in their communities, in their societies. So I think there's a real connection there between ideas of femininity and the way it was kind of perceived in the 19th and early 20th century.
Great. Okay, well, that is the end of our questions. That was quite a few, though. That was really great. Thank you so much for this this conversation. It was really great. I hope everyone enjoyed this talk. Please consider making a donation to enable us to continue to offer these free public programs. Gifts in any amount are appreciated. I'd like to remind you that this was the last of our 3 lectures on talking about race matters. Join the conversation. But you can find the recordings of this presentation and the other presentations in the series on dyckmanfarmhouse.org and on our YouTube channel. And I just thank you so much, Elizabeth, and thank you, everyone. And I hope you have a great rest of your evening.
Thank you so much for having me.